Since the appalling and brutal attack on Jews in Israel on the 7th of October and the taking of hostages, there has been the most terrible, terrible war against the people of Gaza. 6 months of relentless death and destruction. The death of 33,000 people, which include 13,800 children, young people and children. And what we know is that a child is a child wherever they live, wherever they may be caught up in the brutality of war. The humanitarian relief provided by Save the Children has been amazing, quite extraordinary. And we are grateful to them this evening for enabling us to learn more about their work on the ground and how we can support them. They have been working in the occupied Palestinian territory for over 70 years. That's an amazing history. They were there before the conflict, and they will remain long after the conflict has been concluded. May that be swift. They know, as well as anyone, why this conflict is so uniquely difficult from a humanitarian perspective, but still they're there, they're doing whatever is needed. We can learn from their expertise, and I'm so very grateful to them for being here this evening. So we've got a splendid panel. We've got Gareth Owen, OBE, who is the Humanitarian Director of Save the Children. He has spent the last 30 years working in the aid sector. He joined Save the Children in 2002 as an emergency advisor and became Humanitarian Director in 2007. He has led responses to many major emergencies over the past 2 decades, most notably the Iraq conflict, the Asian tsunami, Cyclone Nargis, Haiti, Pakistan, East Africa, Niger, and the Philippines. Wow, what an amazing man. He's played a pivotal role in the development of Save the Children's humanitarian capacity and in the establishment of collaborative hosted entities, including ULRA, the START Network, and the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. Then we have on his left Alexander Betts, who's the Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs. He is amazing. He is based at the Oxford's Refugee Studies Centre and he is the William Golding Senior Fellow in Politics at Brasenose College. His research focuses on the political economy of refugee protection and refugees' access to socio-economic rights and opportunities. He leads the IKEA Foundation-funded Refugee Economies Programme, which undertakes participatory research on the economic lives of refugees in various countries, including Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia. He's got many global accolades as a young leader. The world looks to you for leadership. It is sorely lacking. So you've got a lot on your shoulders there, Alex. But most importantly, last year, Alex was appointed by the Vice-Chancellor to be the university's local and global officer. And I can't tell you how much he's transformed the way in which the university thinks about these things and reacts to these things and enacts policy on these issues. So thank you, Alex. Then finally, well, not really finally, we've got Natasha Kaplinsky, a broadcaster and Save the Children ambassador. She's also my friend, so there. She's one of the UK's best-known broadcasters. She's presented the news for Sky News, BBC News and Channel 5, and now appears on ITV and the ITV London Tonight. Since 2010, she's been a hard-working and dedicated ambassador for Save the Children. She's worked both publicly and behind the scenes to help campaign and fundraise for their many different areas of work. Her support is including visiting projects all over the world, including India, South Africa, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone. In 2011, she played a pivotal role in launching Save's biggest campaign yet, No Child Born to Die. Well, sadly they are. She's been a fantastic ambassador, but she's also been an amazing supporter of Somerville and so many of our initiatives, including our College of Sanctuary. And she's done so many in conversations with our college, which has really spearheaded our work on refugees and sanctuary. She's a proud alumni of Hertford College, but most importantly, she's an honorary Somervillian.
I am.
So, I think I'll now hand over to you, Natasha. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm always looking for an upgrade. Jan, thank you very much indeed. Yes, indeed, I am an extremely proud ambassador of Save the Children for nearly 2 decades, and during that time it has been my huge honour to meet many brave and dedicated Save the Children staff who support children around the world tirelessly affected by natural and human-made disasters and conflicts. As a global organisation, we work to support children's rights to health, to education and safety, and the escalation of violence in Gaza has been extremely distressing to witness. The figures are really shocking. I mean, Jan's mentioned some of them already, but the latest data from the Ministry of Health from Gaza, as Jan has identified, nearly 14,000 children are now dead of the 1.2 million of child population. If you look at that in a different way, that's 1% of all children in Gaza are dead. And you look at it in another way, that's 3 children killed every hour. So in the course of this conversation, we would expect another 3 to 5 children to be killed. So it's a pretty sobering thought, and I'm sure that will feed into the conversations that we have. But it's not just the death rate that is profoundly shocking. Children are maimed, they're suffering with untold physical injuries. Many are left to fend for themselves without any parental support. And that's before we even start to think about any emotional and psychological effect that this will have on them. But children have a special status, as we all know, in conflicts. They have specific vulnerabilities, and they have distinct rights and obligations that we owe to them. They must be protected. And it is a fundamental right of a child to protection. And that's what drives all of us at Save the Children, the right that every single child, wherever they are, whichever side of the border they are on, they are still a child, whatever colour or creed they are, because the only universal language that any of us truly understand is the cry of a child. So we thank Somerville College and Jan and Sarah and everybody here for hosting us. We really are so grateful that you have prioritised this event this evening. We thank you for all of your time for coming this evening, knowing how busy diaries are. The fact that you've shown up this evening and hopefully will be part of this conversation is so hugely important. So thank you very much indeed. And for welcoming us in this really beautiful hall. We really hope that you'll find this conversation enlightening, interesting, inspiring, and we really want you to be part of it. So my job is to help facilitate the conversation. I'm going to be asking a few questions of Alexander and Gareth, and then open the questions up to the floor. So the guys are ready here to answer anything that you want to throw at them. Jan's already given you a full introduction to both of our speakers this evening, so I think let's just crack on rather than me repeating all of their brilliance. But I think you can recognise that they both literally lead the field, and it's a huge honour to be sitting up here with both of you. So thank you very much indeed for your time and sharing your expertise this evening. So Gareth, I mean, you are... I can't tell you how respected you are just, I mean, by me, but within the organisation, not just in the UK, but globally. But perhaps you might just share a bit about how you got to your role and a bit of what you do, because you are so dedicated. It would be nice to, you know, tell people what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, thank you so much, Natasha. It's an honour to be here, and there's some very august company here. Other people who've worked for Save the Children, dedicated humanitarians. There's one sitting in the second row who knows the occupied Palestinian territory far better than I do. And I'd just like to, actually, before we get into it, just dedicate this time to Sameh, who was a member of our Palestinian staff, who was killed in December. He was 39 years old. He died alongside his wife, his 4 children, and a further 20-plus members of his extended family in an airstrike. So that brought it home very much to us at Save the Children's realities for our staff on the front line. I began as a naive young man in aid work 32 years ago. I found myself in a civil war in Somalia. The following year, I spent 8 months in a siege. So the echoes of what's happening today are very personal for me. And I had the privilege of joining Save the Children in 2002. And it's an incredible organisation. Where it wants, as you know, Natasha, with your extraordinary history with us as well, well above and beyond, which we're all very grateful to you for. I mean, people forget how long Save the Children's been around. 1919. Last week I was in the home of the Jebb family, the two sisters who founded Save the Children in 1919, with our president patron, Her Royal Highness Princess Anne, who's been our president/patron since 1970. And we were looking together at a letter written by our founder, Eglantine Jebb, to her mother, saying, Mumsy, as she called her, I've got myself in trouble. I've been arrested in Trafalgar Square. And I love this story. I mean, Princess Anne thought the letter was amazing, because it's an apocryphal story in Save the Children about how protesting against injustices in the world bravely, which has been in our blood for more than 100 years, and how the system reacted to that. So the judge who fined Eglantine £5 proceeded to get his wallet out and pay the £5, and it's considered to be the first donation in history to Save the Children. And I think that's important, because I know there are people here who are studying, politics and internationalism, and the younger crowd here. It's on your watch, folks, that things have to change. And internationalism and the intensely political roots of our organisation are alive today, but we represent that through our action for children the world over. It's our legitimacy in bearing witness to what children experience all over the world. We work in 120 countries. We are in 80 humanitarian hotspots. And we are fighting, and I mean fight, for the rights of children in a very practical way. And we'll get into that this evening. We'll talk more about that. And we reach tens of millions of children every year. But it's getting harder. The politics is getting more difficult. And so for those of you who are here because you're interested in humanitarianism as students, then I applaud you, because we need you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. As you said, we can dig into some of those topics in a moment's time. Alex, obviously everyone's following what's been going on in Gaza, but with your enormous expertise, could you set the recent escalation of violence in context, please?
Yeah. So let me at the outset say thank you very much to Somerville for hosting this meeting. As so often, Somerville is a fantastic convener of very important conversations and activities. And it's an absolute privilege to be here with Natasha and Gareth and Save the Children. I've had the privilege to work with Save the Children over a number of years and found their work to be really significant, really impactful, and it's great that we can have this conversation. I also just want to start with two brief caveats, if I may. The first is that I have a university role in addition to my academic role. I'm speaking here very much in a personal capacity and as an academic, and what I say is not representative of the university, but it's my views and my perspective, and I want to be as open and transparent as I can be, so I think that's important to state. The second thing is I'm absolutely not an expert on the occupied territories, the Middle East. My expertise, if I have any, relates to refugee protection and the politics of humanitarianism globally, so that's very much what I'm drawing upon. And so if I say anything in ignorance, I apologise for that up front. I think when I received this sort of question up front, it was originally phrased in the briefing notes as reflecting on the historical background to how we got to where we are today. And my first thought was, how long have we got? And my second was, how far back do we want to go? I think we can't understand what's happening today in Gaza simply by going back to the 7th of October. We can't understand the previous year without looking at the previous decade. We can't understand the previous decade without looking at the previous century. And we can't understand the previous century without going back at least 2 millennia. And I think the thing about history is told from a particular perspective. It's told through the prism of experience, of culture, and of power. And if I could narrate one history for this region that we would all agree upon, I think we would have already solved the problem and would be able to leave this discussion. I can't do that. I have to acknowledge that it is a deeply contested history. And I think there are obvious reasons for that. We're dealing with a relatively small part of the surface of the world which is sacred to the three most significant monotheistic religions on the planet. We're dealing with an area that's been subject to colonialism, imperialism, by European empire, by the role of the United States, which is deeply contested in terms of the regional geopolitics and has external actor involvement going back throughout the last century, if not further. It's inextricable from the history of the Holocaust, from a series of conflicts that have taken place through 1948, 1967, a series of UN Security Council resolutions that have been implemented to different degrees, the implementation of which have been deeply contested, and a series of conflicts in which history is inextricable from politics. So I can't even begin to give a single narrative account of how we got to where we are today, but I think it's important to recognise the role of history in the politics and the way in which it is contested and narrated from different perspectives for particular purposes. Even a history going back to the 7th of October is something that many people, even in this room, would have different perspectives on. So history and how we got to the present day is consequential, it is political, but there's one thing I'd venture that it doesn't matter for, and that is the basic principle that we need to be able to protect the value of human life, and that regardless of your interpretation of history or politics, there is a deeply important role for humanitarian relief and humanitarian response, and for principles around public international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law, that are inextricable from humanitarianism. And that part of this conversation today needs to be to recognise those principles, the values that underlie them, and regardless of our position in this context, to recognise that it is absolutely unacceptable to see innocent lives lost, and that we cannot simply narrate them away as collateral damage in a conflict that is deeply asymmetrical and imbalanced. And that principles around impartiality, neutrality, have to be observed by all sides in the delivery of that aid and in the upholding of principles of public international law. And so from all perspectives on this deeply contested history, from all perspectives within the politics, there are certain principles that, from my perspective, and from what I would hope would be a universal perspective, we could agree upon, converge around, and use to uphold and support the work that SAVE and many other humanitarian organisations, including local organisations, are trying to deliver on the ground.
Thank you for speaking so eloquently. I mean, it's just so profoundly depressing, everything that you say. But you're right in terms of the convergence of everybody working together. Save the Children specifically, Gareth, have been working in Gaza since 1953. What exactly have we been doing?
So that's a long time. We're one of the most experienced organisations in the occupied Palestinian territories. I'm just going to paint a little bit of a picture quickly, because I think it bears reminding people that just how dire the situation was for children in the occupied Palestinian territories prior to the events of October 7th. After 50 years of occupation, a 15-plus year blockade, periodic cycles of violence, numerous, the COVID pandemic, and then subsequently, since October the 7th, declared openly on the 9th of October a siege that has now lasted for 6 months. And prior to October the 7th, you had 2 million people in the occupied Palestinian territories who required humanitarian assistance already, including 1.2 million children. And 50% of the people in Gaza are children. And 80% of the people who live there are dependent on foreign aid. So already you have a scenario of grave need. 500,000 children prior to October 7th in the occupied Palestinian territories did not have access to quality and safe education. And we did a survey in 2022 of children, and 80% of those children expressed that they were living with depression, grief, and fear in 2022. We'd done a similar survey in 2018, and it was 55%. So already a big upswing as a result of this increasingly difficult environment. And we're a children's rights organisation, and it is patently the case that not all children's rights are equal in the occupied Palestinian territories. An example of this, I think, is particularly egregious. Every year, between 500 and 700 children between the ages of 12 and 17 are arrested in the West Bank and detained and put in military courts. The most common reason for being arrested is stone throwing. The punishment for that is a maximum of 20 years incarceration. Israeli children are not subject to that system. So rights and justice is the real story, and no amount of humanitarian aid is going to bring that alone. So it is a political problem, and we fight and lobby, and have done for many years, for the rights of children to be respected as they are around the world, and that is our job. Alongside many different projects, we have 70 staff across the occupied Palestinian territories. We had 11 partner organisations who are local prior to October the 7th, and they carry out a range of incredibly practical projects, everything from basic things like cash assistance, giving people money that they can then choose how they use it in society. Education, obviously, a big part of our work. Protecting children, seeking ways to protect children and uphold their rights. The classic humanitarian work that we do around child protection, child-friendly spaces, water and sanitation projects, nutrition, food security, everything really. But it's all in the context of trying to find ways to bring humanity to the situation. I think it was Pierre Gaillard, the ICRC chief in post-Rwanda, who said that the basic humanitarian task is to attempt to bring humanity back to situations that simply shouldn't exist. And I think that sums it up very well.
The statistics are so difficult to listen to, let alone actually imagine. So, Gareth, you talk about the 70 colleagues that are working in Gaza along with the partner organisations. How has their mood changed over the last 6 months?
I mean, David probably knows better. He's been there with them more recently. I think it's hard for our Palestinian staff to feel anything other than anger. It's very, very important that they feel a strong sense of international solidarity, which obviously they receive from all 25,000, 30,000 Save the Children staff from around the world. And it is a big ask of our staff to remain impartial, neutral, independent in their actions. And they are very, very brave people. They are, 25 of our staff were inside Gaza and remain there. And we bolstered their presence, as you'd expect, through international solidarity with very brave people, like some who are here tonight, who are willing to go and stand on the front line and put their own lives in danger alongside their Palestinian colleagues. And that is part of what we've always done. So we're in the process of scaling up our response, and we can come on to that. And you'd be surprised how much we're able to do, actually. There's a strong sense that, because we are so focused on the thing that only really brings help, which is a ceasefire and an immediate cessation of hostilities, that's obviously what is required. But we are able, and over 6 months, we have been able to do an awful lot in relation to bringing basic assistance to people. But it's not the be-all and end-all. No. We can come back to that maybe.
Yeah. Alex, international solidarity is obviously completely critical to any kind of resolution. Do you feel that the international community has come together in the way that you might have expected?
I mean, I think what's clear is that humanitarian response is shaped by politics.
Yeah.
And the politics has been deeply challenging. The calls for a ceasefire, let alone a permanent, enduring ceasefire, have been initially very muted and have grown perhaps belatedly. And that reflects the division within the UN Security Council, not just for this conflict, but many others around the world, that it's very difficult to identify states that have been able to provide moral leadership in relation to the conflict. The US, major powers in the Security Council, have been aligned and have had particular positions in relation to Israel and the occupied territories, and that in turn has shaped the scope for international solidarity and humanitarian relief. And so the delays we've had, the significant delays in even opening up the possibility for humanitarian aid delivery, have been a reflection of that wider politics. That it took very long for the two main border crossings to be opened, and even since that some 100 plus days ago that Rafah opened, that Kerem Shalom opened, I think we've had some 24,000 trucks cross the border delivering humanitarian assistance. Now, that may sound like a big number, but relative to some 2 million people facing famine, starvation, dependent on aid, it's been deeply inadequate. And the willingness to be innovative, creative, to negotiate hard for humanitarian access has been flawed. I don't think there has been a shortage of public solidarity. And I actually think the willingness of the public to engage and show solidarity is there. But the mechanisms through which it's been possible to offer that assistance have been deeply limited. I mean, reflecting, for instance, in this country, the Disaster Emergency Committee as a coalition of NGOs and organisations that are supported, they have 3 criteria before they can launch an appeal. And for a long time, they've highlighted that this context is not ripe and ready to launch an appeal. They're now highlighting 13 partner organisations through which the public can show solidarity. But in contrast to the Ukraine response or the Turkish earthquake, that mobilisation and that ability to fundraise has been challenging. Similarly, the questions that have been raised, partly shaped by the context, geographical, political, geographical, the history of aid delivery in the context, there have been questions about neutrality as well as impartiality. And I think that's raised some doubts and questions about, from states, but also public engagement, about the viability of funding certain organisations. So UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, has faced significant accusations of neutrality breach. And the head of UNRWA has acknowledged that those are real. An independent report has been commissioned by the UN. There's been a review within the UN, and it has shown that there have been neutrality breaches. And that, in a way, has affected confidence and trust from states and organisations. But it's also, I think, provided an excuse for a lot of governments to not provide upfront aid delivery and to do less than perhaps they should have done to engage in responsibility sharing on the humanitarian side. And so I think as we move to this phase where it is viable to deliver aid to a certain extent, albeit with major challenges, this is the moment, belatedly, when that solidarity has to emerge, not only through governments no longer having excuses to stay on the sidelines, but also through publics generating momentum through humanitarian giving. I think it's for humanitarian organisations and NGOs to come together, to find mechanisms, as I know SAVE is doing, to work collaboratively, but also to think about how localised responses can emerge, how we can support the people within the occupied territories, within Gaza, subject to all the constraints, all of the vulnerabilities, to be part of the frontline response on the ground,
Gareth,
as I know has been the case in the past.
I mean, that would be interesting. How did the public respond to this? And if the DEC hasn't yet launched an appeal, how have you seen the effect of it within SAVE?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very central question, and I shall speak freely actually about this,
Please
I think,
do.
on this occasion. We have been ready as agencies, operational agencies, since before the end of the year, since in December. Our view was that, given that this is a siege, and I keep coming back to that point, we were only ever going to get stop-start access. That is controlled very carefully, as we all know. So our ability to respond has to be based on a simple emergency ethos of no regrets. We are, by their own estimate now, the World Food Programme believes we are less than 6 weeks away from having to declare famine in Gaza. There is nothing here except a man-made scenario. It is a deliberate act, and there's no shying away from that. There are already pockets of severe hunger in the north of Gaza. The north of Gaza is a ghost town now. Our team went into Khan Yunis. They were horrified a town that used to have 200,000 people in it. It is now a pile of rubble. And what is being stored up in terms of long-term problems is already immense. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine does analysis on the numbers of excess mortality. If we stopped the fighting now, already the excess mortality that has been essentially created for the future in this scenario is numbered conservatively in the tens of thousands of additional deaths, not from bombs and bullets, but from lack of access to sanitation, medicines, all the other things that go in a society in an urban area. So we are very far from the end of the direst aspects of this. And there are things like there are 270,000 tons of solid waste piled up now across the Gaza Strip. 270,000 tons. Imagine that on the streets of Oxford or London. There is something like 37 million tons of rubble. That's 300 kgs per square metre. The estimate of the UN Mine Action Service is that probably, and they're basing this on averages over many conflict settings, 10% of the ordnance that's been dropped is probably unexploded. So that rubble is full of unexploded. This is what happens in war zones, folks. So 65% of the schools have been damaged. And we are at the level of 350,000 children who are already experiencing the risk of severe malnutrition. Now, when we declare severe malnutrition, that is life-threatening. Now, this is the level of reality now that we're facing. So the kind of contortions of avoidance that we see in our political kind of discourse over the last few months, I'm a bit of a writer, and I'm going to use a sort of an alliterative tautology, which I shouldn't do, but it's craven cowardice. But I think that's the only way to describe it. It's craven cowardice. What we are seeing here is an erosion of the principles of humanity and the institutions of humanity that we've built up over 80 years from the last time the world had to face enormous tumult, 50 million people killed. We seem to have either forgotten what that was about, or we are unable now to hold ourselves to account as a global society. So there's some very, very broken things here. And the DEC, a subjective debate over criteria met or unmet, which is essentially what it is, misses this point. Where the children of Gaza are out of time. We know the inevitability here. So the question is, why are we not acting? And the answer, I'm afraid, is the politicization of this scenario and the brutal truth that in order to launch a big appeal with the public, we need a lot of support from major broadcasters and others, and they are debating the criteria.
It's a very difficult thing to hear that, knowing how hard it's been to fundraise within SAVE and having my own personal experiences with relationships that have gone wrong over this conflict. I completely understand that. Would you agree?
So I don't have the depths of insights into the politicisation of aid within the UK that Gareth has. I think, as I said, what's very clear is politics shapes humanitarianism. That for all we have to focus on humanitarian principles, there has been a deep politicisation of aid delivery in this context. Now, that is nothing new. Around the world, we have deep selectivity in humanitarian engagement, and particularly when humanitarian donorship through state mechanisms or through public mechanisms is shaped by governmental roles, inevitably politics plays a bigger part than most humanitarians would like to acknowledge. I think that's a challenge as well for humanitarian organisations, NGOs, but also the United Nations system. I have experience of working for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, in the past. And I think one of the challenges they've always struggled with is having a non-political role within their statute and defining what non-political means. One of the things I've always argued is for UNHCR, non-political doesn't mean not having to be politically aware or undertake political analysis. The challenge for humanitarian organisations is to be able to have the political capacity to analyse the context, environment and the constraints they're in and try to see through the challenges, the opportunities and look for how to mobilise political allies. Now, in the current context, that is an awful lot to ask of humanitarian organisations. The political constraints are so great that identifying allies within the system, nationally within the multilateral system, has become ever harder, I think.
So, having painted an incredibly bleak picture, I'm a simple soul. I'm an emergency responder. I'm a civil engineer. It's practical. It's roll your sleeves up, and what is possible is the way forward. And that is how we do this. We have to be cognizant of everything we're saying here. It is the reality of what we do. Humanitarians are always navigating these kind of dilemmas and often having to go with the least worst option. It isn't hopeless, folks. It isn't hopeless. And hope in these circumstances is an intentional choice. I'm sure, and David's nodding, our Palestinian staff would say they've no intention of giving up. They've no intention of despair. They haven't got that option, so nor do we have that option for them. So we act in solidarity. We were one of the first agencies to get some of those trucks across the border. And that was down to the fact that we have a very good relationship in Egypt with the Egyptian Red Crescent, with the Egyptian Ministry of Health, where you just do whatever it takes, and that is the Save the Children way. We've been able to reach 500,000 people with assistance. It's not enough. A lot of it's very basic stuff. It's water, it's food, it's hygiene kits. It's really just kind of life-sustaining efforts. But you keep going, because having been in a siege, I know the effect that has on people's ability to hold on to hope. You stay and you do whatever it takes. We've reached 40,000 children's families with cash assistance. Now, I was amazed to hear. I thought, how's that going to work? Surely the banking system's collapsed. There are still 2 ATMs working in Rafah. Right? People are adaptive and resilient, and if you want to know how, these are the most adaptive and resilient of all, because they've had to be for years and years and years. So the informal systems, the informal mechanisms come into play. They work in our favour. Our partner organisations and us just do what it takes. We've scavenged across Gaza for medical supplies. We're working with the UK Med team, who is run by a former Save the Children member of staff, David Whittick. Those who know him know that he's got his field hospital with the British government into Rafah. And if, God forbid, there is an incursion into Rafah, which will be catastrophic, utterly catastrophic, we're not budging. We're staying. So we've already got 2 months of supply for our team on the ground. Our international staff and our Palestinian staff are going nowhere because the people can go nowhere. We're already building a primary healthcare centre on the coast because people will displace in those directions. This is what we do. This is what Save the Children has done for 100 years, and we're going to keep doing it. And the politics will be whatever it is. It's a plague on all your houses, as far as I'm concerned, across the board on this. And we have to fight for the soul of the cause and for humanity. This is what it's about. This is what it takes to protect humanity in a world where we seem to be forgetting why we built such an order in the first place.
Gareth, how come we've managed to keep you in this country? Because normally, I mean, you are propelled into a disaster.
I'm getting old, that's why.
Yeah, but in terms of the context of this, I mean, it's an awful comparison to make, but how does this particular conflict connect with the others that you've visited in the past?
I mean, I think, and others can comment in the question in the plenary, I think it is this astonishing level of inhumanity. Everyone's shocked by that. This idea that where is the humanity in this story? That is what our teams are seeing. They're just seeing an utterly dehumanised way of being. There's no trust. And you need trust. We need to be able to trust our relationships with the IDF. We need to be able, when we say to them, this is a house where we have our staff, this is a hospital. There are something like 73 attacks per month on a medical institution inside Gaza. So, if the breakdown of trust it's really, really shocking. Even the most seasoned campaigners that we have, and many of them have been in there. So, it is a terrible failure of international diplomacy, all this, and it's coming on the back of others. And that is why, and I was saying to somebody here from the JCO, politics matters, because we've got to resurrect the sort of things that the Jebs cared about 100 years ago. Internationalism is imperiled here, folks.
I'm going to open it to the floor in just one second, but Alex, I just wanted to pick up on one of the phrases that Gareth just used about that astonishing level of inhumanity. Is that comparable to anything historic that you can cite, or does it exist on its own, what's happening in Gaza at the moment?
I mean, there are quite a catalogue of historical examples of deep inhumanity, of examples where we've had crimes against humanity and significant breaches of international humanitarian law. I mean, as Gareth said, a lot of the history of the 20th century was developing a multilateral architecture, a rule-based international order in which international humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law progressively developed to create a set of standards. I think we can think of many cases of crimes against humanity that have taken place throughout the first part of the 21st century, and kind of putting them on a hierarchy, I think, isn't necessary.
No,
or
perhaps not very productive.
But I think to also come to the question about what's distinctive about this conflict, I think it has features both in terms of the inhumanity, but also the political geography of what's going on. I think it's been deeply urban, and that's a little bit of a trend. We can think about scorched earth tactics in conflicts, what we've seen in Mariupol, for instance, in eastern Ukraine, what we've seen in Syria, Aleppo, Homs, parts of Damascus, that visual impact of total destruction of the urban environment. But I think one of the things that's particularly unique is the aspect of containment, the involuntary immobility of people. In most of the conflicts I've done research in or on, I focus on human displacement. Human displacement is a tragedy. People are displaced from their homes and their communities, but the possibility to flee to safe areas, either within the country or across an international border as refugees, is for the most part there.
Yes.
As horrific as Syria, Ukraine, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq have been, the possibility, at least notionally, has been there to cross an international border, to seek sanctuary, or at least to move to another part of the country that isn't characterized by conflict or persecution. As Gareth said, the total destruction of northern Gaza, the repeat displacement and repeat traumatization of a population, pushing them into the southern part of the country, but with such limited possibility to cross into Egypt, to seek opportunities, as we've seen in earlier conflict, to access visas or onward movement to other parts of the region, hasn't been there. So the political geography of containment makes this an extraordinarily difficult humanitarian context to navigate. And alongside that, the intensity and speed with which the invasion has occurred means that the humanitarian consequences have been exacerbated in a relatively small population.
I mean, it's the uniqueness is that humanitarians normally in conflict are not literally on the battlefield. You know, we're normally dealing with a population that sensibly moves away. So if you take someone like Ukraine, which is quite an old-fashioned war in a way, it's front lines, quite static. If you're 20 kilometres, 30 kilometres away, you're outside of artillery range, you're outside of rocket range, you're pretty safe and life goes on as normal. This is the point that Chris is making. We have to be we're on the battlefield. And that's a very unique aspect of this because it just simply isn't, there's no ability to move. And we've seen the consequences of that when things go wrong with the recent deaths of 7 international staff of the World Central Kitchen. Those vehicles, I mean, people say to me, do you think that was an accident? And the answer is, having experienced the IDF for more than 20 years in my own career, they hit what they aim at. That's the reality of it. And you only have to look at the pictures to see that those vehicles were, whether they knew who was on board and all the rest of it is another story. The investigations will tell us, but that wasn't accidental. So when you're in the battlefield like that, you are at tremendous risk. More than 200 aid workers have been killed. It took the deaths of international aid workers to highlight that point, and that shouldn't be the case. But equally, a similar number of journalists have been killed. It is an intensely small area that's experiencing an enormity of violence, and that's its uniqueness, I think.
Thank you. Right. Open to the floor. Thank you very much. I'm wondering whether we're going to get a microphone to you.
Do you want to see a video, Natasha?
Oh, yes. I tell you what, while we're getting a microphone to you, we're going to show a short film. Do you want to introduce it?
Yeah, since everyone's feeling rightly quite challenged by what we're saying, we've got a short video, I believe, from our colleagues in Gaza. This is our emergency health unit team, paediatricians and paediatric nurses who are on the ground helping children, and they're seeing upwards of 200. I think the hospital is seeing upwards of 200 patients a day. 40% are children. There's been more than 1,000 children who've lost one or both legs, amputees. So it is very, very violent for children. Children are 7 times more likely to succumb to blast injuries than an adult, simply because of their physiology. So this is very, very recent, from the last few days on the ground in Gaza.
Thank you.
So this is Julia's bed. Julia is 3 months old, and she was born and raised until now in tents in the war. Julia is not alone. Almost 180 newborn children daily in this war. A lot of people, like Julia's mother, a lot of women are now suffering in the tents without clean or hygiene needs or even food to the breastfeed. I asked Julia's mother about the breastfeeding, and she told me that since the beginning of this war, she did not have any adequate food for once. Enough liquids, healthy food, vegetables, fruits, enough meals a day. So women and newborn are suffering because of the food and because of living in tents. Tents are not clean. Women are suffering in the schools as shelters, in the hospitals are as shelters, or in the displacement spots or tents as the place where am I now.
اليوم احنا رايحين على مخازن الأطلس الواقعة في رفح عشان نتفقد شحنات الأدوية اللي تم جلبها استجابة للطوارئ في غزة. الطريق عادة لا تأخذ أكثر من 5 دقائق، بس احنا نظراً للازدحام الشديد والنزوح الغير اعتيادي إلى مدينة رفح، الطريق ستأخذ منا أكثر من 20 دقيقة إلى نصف ساعة. الطريق كمان فيها تحديات أخرى كالهدم اللي متواجد على جانبي الطريق. اليوم وصلتنا أول شاحنات من الأدوية، هي عبارة عن 69 باليت من أدوية مختلفة سيتم توزيعها على الشركاء معنا في قطاع غزة للاستجابة للطوارئ في قطاع غزة. من الأمور الأساسية لأنه إحنا نشوف البلت هاي، إنه إحنا لازم نرفع الديفايس هذا الصغير، واللي هو عبارة عن قارئ أو مقياس لدرجة الحرارة خلال رحلة البلت من البلد الأم حتى وصولها إلى الوير هاوسز في قطاع غزة، عشان نتجنب أي تلف لأي من المواد الطبية أو الأدوية اللي إحنا جلبناها. برغم كل هذا ستبقى إنقاذ الطفل ستواجه جميع التحديات فقط للاستجابة للطوارئ ولتقديم أفضل ما يمكن أن نقدمه لأطفال قطاع غزة.
So the person at the end there is a paediatric doctor from the UK, from the NHS, who's working with our team. I think he's been in there for the last few weeks.
Well, I mean, you hear them sometimes speaking on the radio, and just the level of distress that they report is quite something. Right, the microphone was already... Yeah, would you mind telling us who you are? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Maisie. I'm a second year and I study classics here at Somerville. And I was wondering, as we can all see, and as you've mentioned, the conflict is very unbalanced, but there's a lot of emphasis put on neutrality. Why is that, and in what ways do organisations ensure neutrality is kept up?
Excellent question, Maisie. Thank you very much. We've got a computer just distracting Gareth for half a second. Who's going to answer that first?
Great question. Very difficult, neutrality. I mean, neutrality is an operational principle. In other words, it's designed to create a distinction between ourselves and combatants and other parties who may be present. So it's about access, and it's about us being able to go about our humanitarian work, which is enshrined in international humanitarian law as a right. Neutrality is very difficult to maintain. in today's world, the world of social media, the world of fake news, the world of misinformation, all manner of forces can work against the truth, and that places our staff in great difficulty. And it is, all conflicts are like that. I've been involved in many over many years, and you start out attempting neutrality, and you seek to hold as much neutrality as you can, but many things can conspire against you. We are working very hard to point out that we are pro-truth and pro-children in this conflict, and that is all we are. But in pointing out the consequences and the facts and the figures, as I have been doing tonight, that will be interpreted by the world in many different ways, and people will choose a view based on what we are saying. We won't stop doing that. It's why we beam ceasefire on the side of the House of Parliament. It's why we challenge all leaders to respect, what we've worked so hard and how much blood has been spilt throughout a century to create notions of, there are actors like international humanitarian organisations who are neutral, who are not party to the conflict. It is very, very hard to maintain.
Can I just add something to that? So, humanitarian principles have been significant and acknowledged and emerged since the Battle of Solferino, and are central to distinguishing humanitarian actors on the battlefield and beyond. There's very valid academic debate about the challenges associated with different humanitarian principles, including neutrality, the extent to which it enables humanitarian access through legitimacy, the extent to which it enables humanitarian actors to be seen as distinctive and to be able to enter contexts where otherwise their presence might be contested by a country that has sovereignty over the territory in which humanitarian delivery takes place. But there are also real questions that many organisations face in particular contexts about whether and to what extent they apply those principles of neutrality and impartiality. And different organisations end up occupying different positions on that spectrum. So some organisations combine a humanitarian role with an advocacy function, and sometimes that advocacy function is in tension with neutrality. Sometimes the reality of the way in which humanitarian organisations have to work with nation states, or indeed with non-state armed actors, in order to deliver aid, compromises neutrality. So in regions like Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, to be able to function and deliver aid, there has to be a relationship with UN humanitarian peacekeepers. There's sometimes in certain parts of the world has to be a relationship established with non-state armed actors that compromises elements of neutrality. So I think it's worth highlighting that in a way there's a sort of fiction of the sacrosanct nature of these humanitarian principles, but humanitarian practice is deeply complex, and a lot of research around it shows that in different contexts, different organisations position themselves differently, and where organisations are on that spectrum in a particular context shapes sometimes how effective they are.
Yeah. I describe it, it's the primary task of the leaders. It's the subjective practice of acquired wisdom. As a child rights organisation, we do not consider, we will not be neutral in the face of egregious violations of children's rights. But in other settings, we will choose to take a more neutral stance, because ultimately what we're wrestling with, and we wrestle with it every hour of the day, and the stakes are very high if we get it wrong, is impact. What are we trying to achieve? What is the best route to that? And it's case by case, context by context, and even sometimes, community by community, district by district, house by house. It can be that level of granularity, because you're constantly negotiating with a multiplicity of actors, and you have to have your eyes open the whole time.
And again, not wanting to make it too academic, what you've described is a particular ethical framework. It's in a way a virtue ethics approach, where you're saying it's judgment, it's experience for the organisation, it's leadership. Whereas historically, I think organisations have often looked at it in ways that moral philosophers would think of as deontological, universal principles that you absolutely apply, and you never deviate. Others have gone towards the consequentialist end of the spectrum and said, whatever saves lives, whatever delivers rights to people is what we do. And that sort of almost virtue ethics framework, I think, is emerging in the humanitarian space to say, it's judgment, it's got to be thoughtful judgment, it needs to take into account the context, but also what the knock-on effects are likely to be for subsequent work.
I mean, we're principled pragmatists, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. I mean, you leave your principles at the gate when you go onto a battlefield, I can assure you, and you have to, they're always with you, they're touchstones that guide you, but forces will act upon you that you cannot control. And that is when you have to get back to the subjective practice of wisdom as leaders. There's no rule book, in that sense. The last time neutrality was an operationally practical tool, I mean, we'd debate this, David, after maybe, but it's quite a long time ago, in all honesty. And if you hide behind these theories, you can get yourself into an awful lot of trouble. You have to hold it as a touchstone to guide you, and then you have to interact with the real world, I'm afraid.
Maisie, that was a brilliant question, so thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else noticed the church bell, but that was 1 hour chiming, and we talked about how many children died in an hour, so 3 children would have died since we started this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction to this topic. My name is Brenda Kelly. I'm an obstetrician in Oxford, and I'm here with several members of Healthcare Workers for Palestine. I'm also a member of a team that has worked in Gaza, the Oxford Gaza Medical Team. We've been teaching in Gaza for over 15 years, and some of our team are currently in Gaza at Al-Khazal Hospital. I just want to touch a comment and then a question for the panel. Neutrality, the word neutrality, has been lost in the fog of war. And I say that because as healthcare workers, you alluded to the humanitarian workers who've been tragically killed and to the journalists who've been tragically killed. As it currently stands, we know, and this is off the end of January, of over 480 healthcare workers who've been killed.
That's right.
An excess of 800 have been abducted.
Yeah.
We heard sadly today that Chief Orthopaedic Surgery, Dr. Dan, has been killed as a result of the torture during his detention. When we as healthcare workers have tried to enter into this humanitarian space and raise awareness and get solidarity from our medical fraternity in the UK, but also across the world, we've been hit with this word neutrality. And there is a deep misunderstanding in healthcare and in politics as to what medical neutrality is. So I just want to take a moment to highlight that very early on in this conflict, we had loss of medical neutrality. And medical neutrality in international law is that every healthcare facility is protected.
That's right.
Those who work in it are protected.
That's right.
The patients who arrive are protected. And those premises must be protected from competent forces. Right. We mentioned, Alex, you mentioned how different this war is in relation to political geography. And Gareth, you articulated the lack of humanity and this absolute precipice that we're looking into. How do we crawl back out of this with the loss of humanity that we've seen? But one of the intentional political weapons here, really early on, in the autumn of 23, was the intentional dehumanization of Palestinian people. Right. Anytime I or any of the members of our team did any media, we weren't asked about the stuff that we were expert on. We were asked, did we condone Hamas? We were asked that when we were in Gaza, did we see Hamas? And I'm quite certain that at some point, children's charities who dared to speak up about this were asked if they were aware that Hamas were operating in playgrounds. So I think we have two issues. One is just to remind everyone here that there is neutrality in terms of, as been discussed here, there's medical neutrality, which is an international law, is yet one of another of the laws that have been broken. And then we have this issue about the profound dehumanization, which is happening now, but on the back of 70 years of dehumanization. Thank you.
I think Brenda deserves a round of applause,
Yeah,
and all of her colleagues. Thank you so much, Brenda. We are full of admiration and respect for you and your colleagues, and thank you very much indeed for speaking to us and coming to us this evening. Thank you. Anybody else? Please, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Roger McCormick, a.k.a. Sophie McCormick's husband. I'm always pleased to come here. I first met my wife approximately 200 yards from where I'm now sitting. I won't tell you when. That would be... I was very struck by Alex's reference to the people of Gaza being containment, and Gareth said something similar about them not being able to get out of Rafah and cross the border. And so my question is the obvious one. Why is that? Why is it that Egypt and perhaps Jordan won't provide places of refuge so that the people would be at least free from the danger of military operations? Humanitarian aid could be more easily, excuse me, more easily provided. And it would provide something of a breathing space from the day-to-day, daily nightmare of constant death, threats of famine, and so on. And I do think that although this is not going to provide the answer to the problem, it would provide at least a breathing space for the warring factions themselves to sit back and have a more considered reflection on what's going on and what their part in it is. Yeah. I know that's a big hope, but also the world at large could perhaps think more seriously, and rather than these rather facile references to two-state solutions without anyone really trying to explain what that means and why it's never worked, but come up with something that perhaps offers a little more constructive approach to finding a path to a lasting peace. So the first step I'm asking is, why is it that the neighbouring states, especially Egypt, but perhaps Jordan, are not offering something like that, so that we don't have this terribly compressed, nowhere to go situation for these people?
Yeah. Alex, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can start. I think what clearly in an ideal world would need to happen is people need to be able to leave Gaza. People need to be able to cross borders. There needs to be the possibility for humanitarian evacuation. That Gaza, tragically, is uninhabitable for many people, and to be able to sustain basic minimum conditions of human dignity, there needs to be the possibility for people to leave. Then there is going to be a huge reconstruction and rebuilding project that will have to happen to get anywhere near restoring conditions for flourishing human life in Gaza. And that's even before we get to the question of long-term political settlement. The politics of why this is not happening, I think, are multifaceted. I think there are obvious reasons why Israel is not going to open up opportunity to move. There are reasons why in Egypt, large-scale border crossing is going to be challenging and destabilizing. I think there's a really valid question to ask about why regional neighbors are not showing humanitarian solidarity and creating that opportunity. And I guess, again, in a complex context, a couple of things could stand out. There are some 6 million Palestine refugees around the world. A significant number are spread across the region: Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, particularly before the Syrian conflict. There are some 58 recognized refugee camps for Palestine refugees across the region. And many of those contexts are seen as touch points for potential conflict, are highly political and politicized within those countries. And actually changing those dynamics across those countries is something that is problematic. I think the other thing to acknowledge is that the occupied territories represent a political football in regional geopolitics. And actually, for many powers across the region, being able to highlight that there are more than 2 million people in Gaza suffering is politically useful. And actually the challenge, I think, to many of those neighboring countries is to question the sincerity of their commitment to the people of Gaza, and to see and recognize and to be called out for the trade-off between their geopolitical interests and the humanitarian needs of a population with whom one would hope they would show and express solidarity.
Yeah, nothing to add really. I mean, just a point about what happens if you are displaced in that way across the border. You stay displaced for anywhere between 10 and 15 years. Ask the Rohingya, ask numerous other people. So it solves one problem and creates another. And then, but primarily it's the geopolitics, as Alex has said.
Got about 15 more minutes, so let's try and get through as many questions as possible. Thank you very much indeed. We've referred to you a lot this evening, so
Well, yes,
rightly so.
Yeah.
So I'm David Skinner. I'm here as a husband of a Somervillian, 500 metres from here. So you win. I've also, like Gareth, worked for Save the Children. I think you've got 2 years on me. So and around the world. And just to say that the point, and I've just come back from Palestine, but the big point is that we can't get in and do the stuff that we normally do. Gareth just referred to the Rohingya. 1 million people came across the Naf River in 2017 in the face of the most appalling humanitarian violations in Myanmar. Bangladesh, great act of humanitarian solidarity, said, fine, you can stay and look after you. We'll make sure you're looked after. Got some comments about the Bangladeshi government since then, but back then they were fantastic. Within weeks, organizations like Save the Children had established a functioning refugee camp with health, with education, with food, and with everything. We know what to do. If we were able to get into Gaza properly, we would be able to sort this out. And that, as a humanitarian, Gareth will confirm, is the most frustrating part about this. We know what to do. We can see what's happening, but we just can't get in at the scale that we're doing. Extraordinarily brave colleagues are in there doing what they can, but there is a limit. My question is, again, like Gareth, I've been involved with many, many responses, and you spend all your time in the immediacy of the response dealing with the immediate problems, and you're looking as principled pragmatists, how do you solve this? How do you save another life? How do you educate another child, and so on? My question is, what can we be doing now to be thinking about what happens after there is a ceasefire? After there is a ceasefire, there is going to be enormous needs for development. It's going to be really difficult, but conceptually easy. I mean, we've got to demine it and rebuild. Expensive, but we can do it. How can we start to heal the children in Gaza? How can we start to heal the children in Israel as well, who are being taught about the dehumanization of Palestinians? If we can't do this, this cycle is just going to continue. So what is the role, Gareth? I've asked myself this question.
I was going to say, this is a rhetorical question.
How can organisations like Save the Children, how can the international community work towards trying to heal some of the immense damage that is being done to children in Palestine, in Gaza, on the West Bank, and actually also in Israel?
Just by your question, we can tell that you're an optimist, because I'm not sure there's an answer to it, but I don't know whether Gareth
You
wants
can't
to
do
give
the
it.
job that Gareth and I do
Unless you
without
are
being an
being an
optimist.
Stubborn optimism is
You
the gig.
cannot spend time in the places where Gareth and I spend without believing that at some stage it's going to be better. I spent 3 years in Afghanistan. I'm still an optimist, despite that.
It's an enormous question. I don't really know the answer, but I think it's obvious that there's a sort of mutual catastrophe here between the people of Israel and the people of Palestine. That's played out forever. And how bad does it have to get before braver leaders than the ones who are in play today in the whole of the world? I'm not just talking about Palestinian and Israeli leaders. I'm talking about the whole of the world's leadership. How do they get back to international diplomacy of a kind that works? You know, we've seen the US be more assertive. The geopolitics is shifting. Someone said to me at the start, the US is sending a warship. It's like, no, they're sending 2 battle carrier groups. That's 14 warships. That's a shift in geopolitical stance of the one world's supposedly superpower. So these are very big forces of political change that are happening around us, and our role in that is to speak the truth, constantly speak the truth for children, and be brave in doing that. In response, straight away, day one, the questions came to us, and we knew. I mean, those of us who've been involved for a very long time in this challenge, and David's been and I have two of them. You know exactly how the playbook goes. So much so that I could write it down for our leaders and say, this will happen, and then this will happen, this will happen. It's so fast now, the role of social media, the discordancy in the world in general, just fuel on the fire in such a huge way. And of course, events are so different, compared to, say, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, the last time it was ago. It's so much more difficult. So does it have to get much worse? I mean, how much worse does it have to get before sanity and humanity come to the fore? And I don't know the answer to that, other than we have to be brave and loud and relentless, and we've taken an awful lot of, kind of heat for our kind of a stance and advocacy from literally everybody, high-profile supporters on day one, of all kind of political persuasions and kind of, views on this have come at us saying, condemn these people, condemn that, all of that. We're going to talk about children relentlessly, and we're going to do what Pierre Gaillard pointed out after the Rwanda genocide, attempt to bring humanity back into this situation, and we will not stop. And I'm not sure beyond that, and just this mobilise. And I look at the students in the room and think, engage, please engage, because if you don't, I don't know how the world's going to deal with the the planetary level, we're not there yet, but planetary level challenges like climate change, without international cooperation. This is such a lightning rod on all the ills that we face in relation to how we cooperate as nations and as a global humanity. We've got to fix that. We've done our best, in practical sense, but we've all failed. It's going to be on your watch. Sorry about that. So it's good that you're here tonight.
We're going to build to a conclusion in a minute to see what we might do as a group to move forward, but let's just see if we can slot another couple of questions. So they're both coming from this row. Thank you very much.
Hi,
relatively short. Thank you very much.
My name is Brewer. I work at the Wellcome Trust, and I'm an Oxford alumni. I'd love to hear your personal opinions on what you see with organisations that haven't been showing solidarity, institutions like this university or workplaces like the one that I work at. Wrongly, they don't take a stance, and I think we like to default to we're not humanitarian actors, we're apolitical. So I'd love to hear, how do you think it's fundamental that you see non-humanitarian actors taking action to support the work that SAVE are doing? And what can we do as individuals, as students, as employees? What can we do in our workplaces or places of study? Is it a matter of donating more money, or is there more that we can do to help you deliver the work that you do and protect children and deliver justice?
River, can we leave that to the last question, because I really think that's a good...
Fantastic question.
It's a good way that we kind of leave this room. So thank you very much indeed for raising that. Let's just move the microphone to the next lady. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Monique. I'm studying theology at Oxford and training to be a vicar in the Church of England. My question, I'd like some more of your optimism, really. I think watching it unfold in the news in terms of the ICJ ruling, not seeing that seem to have much impact. You've talked about the failure of international diplomacy. Just wondering what you think the future of organisations like the UN and the ICJ have after we've seen it all fail really miserably.
Okay. Dinner's going to have to be postponed, I think, for that to answer that one. I think the very short answer is it's a brave ruling. I think, to see the ICJ ruling as it came, and to see how it came about from South Africa, I think it shifts. There's nobody has a free pass anymore to behave in, so that's a sign for optimism. I know for sure the conversation is on at the senior levels of the UN, Gutierrez and others. They know how difficult and how defunct the apparatus of the Security Council is. It's going to have to, it's going to have to come fast, because we're seeing global events, Ukraine, and it's the use of humanitarian language, and it's, Vladimir Putin described going into Ukraine as a humanitarian intervention under Chapter 7 of the UN mandate. The IDF will talk about forced displacement being legal under the guiding principles, but these are manipulations of the rules. They're not respecting the rules, and we're going to have to watch this space carefully. And I think there is a strong role for interfaith, and always has been in this. So, be a champion.
Thank you, Monique.
Yes. Dag Hammarskjöld once said the UN was created not to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell. And Antonio Guterres has said, I think rightly, that if the UN didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Despite the limitations, despite the polarization of the UN Security Council, the UN is about far more than the Security Council. It's about the specialist agencies. It's about a space for multilateral diplomacy. It's a space where nations, despite their disagreements, can come together, recognizing their sovereignty, and do the minimum that can be done in any geopolitical context to come to some consensus, if not consensus, to initiate debates, sometimes in private, sometimes publicly. I think we have an unraveling of the post-Second World War consensus. The context in which the UN was created was auspicious for multilateralism. The Soviet Union stayed out of the initial negotiations, and so we ended up with significant US leadership. We had a high point for multilateralism in the aftermath of the Cold War, when we had a unipolar system, when the US, particularly under Bill Clinton's presidency, was able, for better or worse, to purport to be the global police person. That's something that is no longer possible with the diffusion of global power. So I think as we move to a multipolar world, with the rise of China, India, Russia, the BRICS, we no longer have the ability for a handful of Western, supposedly liberal states to determine the structures of global governance. I think simultaneously what's happened is we've seen a shift in the political economy around the world as well. As we have the undermining of industrialization in the West, we have the polarization of our societies. Jobs through automation and deindustrialization are leaving Europe and North America, and that's creating some of the conditions for political populism, scapegoating of migrants and refugees, and the rise of the far right in Europe and North America. And the far right is often skeptical about multilateralism, international engagement, principles of liberal solidarity. I think what we need to do is protect and safeguard those norms, but we also have to reinvent them as global norms, recognize that those are universal principles that should be upheld regardless of global geopolitics, regardless of the distribution of power in the international system. But law, I think, is one of those areas that represents a bulwark. The ICJ, public international law, our courts. At a time of political majoritarianism, we have to hold on to that and hold on to the principles of internationalism, multilateralism, and international law.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes left, and I'd quite like to pick up on Brewer's brilliant question, which was, it's all very well us, I mean, I'm paraphrasing much of what you say, Brewer, but this is what I wanted to end on. It's all very well us sitting here, dedicating our time, talking about it, thinking about it, but what do we actually do? And so, Gareth, I guess that is on you. What do we do?
Are you familiar with the poem First They Came? First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. So you know their poem, right? That's the point. You can't sit this out. If you sit it out, if you hold any office of leadership, you can't sit this out now. This is world history time. For you, don't be afraid of that. Don't let it overwhelm you. You're going to have a reaction to that that's going to be an emotional sense of, whatever it may be. Work with that. I don't think we can ask you while you're a student to donate, huge amounts, but, do what you can to mobilize consciousness and ask your parents to donate. And we play the long game at Save the Children. Whatever walk of life you go into, be incredibly successful in that walk of life and make a contribution to the whole of humanity every day that you can be proud of. And how you do that will be up to you. And then maybe we'll start to move towards a better place.
Thank you. Briefly, have you got another answer to that?
I mean, I think perhaps the elephant in the room on this is you mentioned, Brewer, the role of universities. And I'll answer it in terms of the role of universities and my view on that. I think universities have been in a challenging position on this. One only has to look to what's going on in the US to see that. My view is that universities have to create the conditions in which students, staff, academics can speak freely and openly within the boundaries of the law. And we have to encourage that and recognise that that is important. We also have to create the conditions under which we respect difference, that recognising by coming together and respecting difference we'll move forwards. That open debate has to be a really important principle. And I think we have to not shy away from that as universities, to step up to the plate and say, whatever your perspective and opinion, we will respect you. We encourage civilised debate. We encourage protest within the boundaries of the law, and we will uphold your right to do that. Now, I think what certainly many universities, including this one, have been concerned about is taking overtly political positions and prescribing to everyone in our community what they should think about any political issue. And that's very dangerous territory to move into. And for universities to have immediately moved into that position after October the 7th would have been extremely dangerous, risky, and alienating and divided communities. And so I think the primary duty is to ensure we're very clear that we openly support the rights of everyone to engage, and engage through civilised debate, engage by recognising and respecting difference, and through that we can get unity. I think one of the things I've seen, and I think has been really important, is the role of our students in pushing universities, in pushing for better answers, in a way that enables university leaderships to hopefully listen and learn. And I think universities in general perhaps need to do a better job of convening in the way that Somerville's done tonight, listening, being open, and perhaps transparent about what we can do, what we can't do, and taking people with us on that journey.
Okay, thank you, Brewer. Thank you. That was an excellent question. And Maisie, your question. Brenda, thank you for everything that you said. Roger, David, and Monique, thank you for bringing this conversation into just a different level. It's been such an honour to be here this evening, and I feel like we could just continue to talk for a very long time. But as long as we continue to act, that's the main thing. Gareth and Alex, thank you both very much for your, just your expertise and your wisdom. So many times through this conversation, I just got a shiver over my body because it's just so important what we're discussing, and it's been an honour to sit here with you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha.
Yeah.
It's very kind of you to come and host this one.